Thanks very much, Professor Crane, for your very gracious introduction. Thank you all for coming out this evening on a brisk evening and for having me in the Williams community for the last few hours I've been here. I find it always energizing and encouraging and just optimism building to spend time with college students. My own children are slightly older than college age now, and I miss them, and so it's a way to replicate both the excitement of having my children around and to feel good about the future of America and the world, to spend time with groups like yours. So thank you for having me come here. I should point out I've been around this area a lot of times before, although this is my first time inside a campus building. In my previous pre-China life as an avid amateur pilot, I've used your airport nearby many a time, and I've been as low as law and decency allow over the campus so as not to disturb anybody. But it's nice to see it from ground level, and it looks even nicer this way. I should say, too, it's an honor to be part of the series that you've put together on the future of capitalism. I know both of the previous speakers, respect them both enormously, and I'm very honored to be part of this sequence. And we'll try to do my part for the program you all have put together. This is, as you heard from Professor Crane, I've been out of the U.S. for just about 3 years during the time I was in China, and this is one of the first times I've had an opportunity in oral form as opposed to writing to try to put together the things I have seen while living in Shanghai and Beijing and traveling through China for an audience outside China, for an audience that I know has a wide range of expertise about China and East Asia. Many of you know far more about China than I do. Some of you grew up there. Many of you speak the language, as I barely do, although I have some reading comprehension. Some of the rest of you are just beginning the process of learning about China and how you will engage with this growing part of the world. As I've tried to think about the way I could most usefully present and put together what I've seen and thought about over the past 3 years, I've reflected on the fact that there are different kinds of speeches, different categories. I was once in my life a speechwriter. I spent a couple of years as Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter in the White House. I don't usually publicize this fact because Jimmy Carter's speeches they don't go down with the Gettysburg Address and all the rest. He was a good man, but not renowned with Demosthenes and the rest as an orator. I will point out that I had a little Wikipedia feud earlier this year. Jon Favreau, who's the speechwriter for President Obama, is 27 years old, and a number of newspaper articles pointed out that he was the youngest ever chief presidential speechwriter. Somebody, not me, but related to me, wrote into the newspaper to say, no, he wasn't the youngest one. In fact, I was 2 months younger when I had that job with President Carter. And so now his Wikipedia entry says, he's the youngest chief speechwriter to work for a president who gives good speeches. So that's the distinction. But as I've thought about the categories of speeches, I thought they generally fall into three large groups. There are speeches that reinforce what you already think or know. And if you think about it, almost every political speech has this function. It's somebody who's trying to give you a crisper way of thinking, something you're already prone to believe. Especially political rally speeches do that. There are speeches where the content might or might not be surprising, but the sheer authority of the person saying it gives it a kind of extra oomph. I think of this as John Madden as a football commentator or John McEnroe as a tennis commentator. They may not be saying anything different from what you or I would say, but the fact that it's John McEnroe saying it gives it extra oomph. Then there are speeches whose main purpose is to give you information you didn't have before. These range from the college lecture to a wide variety of other similar things. And it's in that category that I'm going to try to make this presentation with the following twist. I think that the most useful thing I may be able to do for you is to emphasize things that I suspect you might not know about China, or you might not already believe or think. And my measure, my yardstick for selecting these items is things that I myself did not know until 3 years ago when I moved to Shanghai with my wife. I'd been to China off and on since 1986, when we first went there while living in Japan, and there's a long, tangled story I'll give you later if you want about how we got our visas to get in there, involved learning the language of Esperanto, so we could get visas to the World Esperanto Congress. But having having been in and out, I'll tell you the Esperanto story. The most heartbreaking aspect of the World Esperanto Congress held in Beijing in 1986, where most of the participants were Chinese. The second largest delegation was Bulgarian for a reason I don't know. Then we were part of the American delegation because my wife is a linguistics professor, was then, and her friend was chairman of the World Esperanto League. The most heartbreaking aspect was whenever there was an announcement to the effect of the bus leaves at 8 a.m. tomorrow, or the dinner is on the third floor, or here is how you file for your reimbursement, those announcements were always in English. And this was a certain poignancy to the Esperanto movement. But having been there starting in 85 and 86, when China was a very different place from now, there still were things I had not appreciated before being there. And so the way I'm going to proceed for the course of this talk is first I'm going to go through a taxonomy or a list of things that I think are underappreciated, especially in the United States, about China, at least because I underappreciated them before living there. That will be my first part of the presentation. Second, in keeping with the larger future of capitalism theme of the series, I'm going to ask what are some of the implications for the idea of capitalism, of some of the trends that I've mentioned and some others too. Third, I'm going to go into what some of the implications of what I've discussed might be for America in both economic and political realms. And finally, for the students in the room, I'll have a little inspirational brief coda about what this means for you in the future life that you live in America, in Europe, in East Asia, wherever it might be. So that's the plan. And then I'll be happy to take questions on any topic, including politics, speech writing, private aviation, you name it. First category, and the one where I put my heart into this most, which is the things that you might not know about China or that I didn't sense as deeply before I lived there. The first on this list, and the one that really strikes me most powerfully, is how big and chaotic and diverse and fractionated and individualistic this one country that we often think of as one big monolith is. Why it often is more useful to think of 1 billion plus individual Chinese, or a couple of dozen provinces, or a couple of thousand companies, or a couple of hundreds of thousands of small mom-and-pop stores, than it is to think of China, or the Chinese. The reason I think this is important is because the Chinese government often feeds an image which is latent in the Western or the non-Chinese consciousness, which is of China as one big, undifferentiated mass on the march. One indication of this, you may remember the Olympic opening ceremonies a little more than a year ago in Beijing when we were living there, and the image of thousands of people in perfect precision beating on the drums, most of those people soldiers who were trained for that episode. Or the first half of the 60th anniversary parade you may have seen from downtown Beijing last week on October 1st. I say the first half for a reason I'll get to the second half later on. The idea was very much what the government of China, the central government, would like to present to its people, that everything is in order, the people are as one, everything is coordinated and precise. I was struck by both how impressive that was and how different it was from all the rest of China every other instant I was seeing it. Where, in fact, if you go down the list of factors that unify or divide a culture or part of the world, you see how many there are that are centrifugal as opposed to centripetal, that is, of making it seem like more like Europe, with a variety of places living together in loose confederation than as one unified state. Many of you here are studying Chinese languages or know Chinese languages. You know how different languages are in different parts of the country, not simply in accents, but sometimes in language families. I won't even belabor that point since many of you know it here. The regional differences are certainly as strong as those in the United States, not simply in look and geography and style, approach to life, but also in loyalties. Shortly before I left Beijing, I was at a seminar at Peking University about U.S.-China tensions and all the things that America and China might do to get on each other's nerves. And the conversation was more or less boring and going along at a crawl until one of the people from Beijing said, you know, what I really hate is I hate people from Shanghai. And then we got there was some juice to the conversation. There are rifts within the political system. There are as many of you know, there are official racial minorities in China. The majority Han, and I believe 55 other people. Some of them only slightly different, some of them quite different. The economic levels of the country are very different. In the south of China, where the land is naturally lush and the rain is much more abundant, the water is abundant, to be a farmer is not necessarily to have that hard of a life. The ground is fertile, you can raise both crops and animals. In the north of China, which is very, very dry, to be a farmer can mean being very, very poor, since you live or die year by year or send your children to school depending on the rainfall. There are differences between rich and poor and all the rest, and one other difference that I think is very important to get across, which is the areas in which, well, let me put it this way. Why is it, therefore, that we think of China as one big place, when you're there, it seems like hundreds of places or thousands of places or billions of people? I think there are some obvious reasons. There is some shared sense of Chinese culture and its 5,000 years of heritage and all the rest. And there also are a few things which actually are united across the entire country. There are particular huge projects, like the Olympic game or like the 60th anniversary celebrations. There are controls on education and media and other things which shape a certain common outlook on particular issues. And to wrap up this first point of underappreciated differences, I think there is a national self-awareness, which I assert is one of the few things which really does bring China together, which can make for great complications in its dealings with the outside world. And I use the term national mythos for this, national self-idea, and here's what I mean. The way Americans think of themselves doesn't necessarily correspond to how we actually are or how the rest of the world thinks of us. But part of our national identity is either you could think of as the Pearl Harbor or the Gary Cooper approach. Gary Cooper for the older members of the crowd like me. That is a society which is slow to anger, doesn't want to get in other people's ways, but when you cross it, it's going to really hit back with everything it has. As I say, that's not how people necessarily see us, but there's a certain 9/11 component to that too. I'd say the counterpart for China would be a national mythos of being disrespected and mistreated by the outside world, especially the white European outside world, of in this self-view of being essentially harmonious, very highly cultured, a long-standing civilization that is being disrespected, starting with the hundreds of years of humiliation that the Brits enacted with their conquest, the Opium Wars, and afterwards. I mention this because the times when I was in China over 3 years, where I most sensed this was one unified people who were hearts beating as one, was when this sense of national dignity was offended, when there was something happening that made China as a whole, use the phrase, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, or feel that Westerners were not treating them with proper respect. I'll come back to this later on, because my first point is it's a place of a million contrasts and a million different forces, but it can become unified in a way which is difficult for everybody else if this sense of being having its dignity looked down upon is not properly observed. So that's the first and longest of these underappreciated points that I wanted to stress. A second one on this list is how many of its own problems China has. China, as it comes across in the mass media in the Western world, is either having these gigantic ceremonies like the Olympics or the 60th anniversary games or parade, or doing feats that are beyond the reach of normal nations. It's building new airliners now. It's having hundreds of miles of high-speed trains. It's pulling itself out of the economic slowdown in a way that other countries cannot. And certainly it is true that there are things that the Chinese government has been able to pull off, but anybody who has been in China, as most of you have, know how serious and numerous are the problems the leaders of that country have to deal with. And I'll just tick them off rather than elaborate them at the moment. On the economic front, China's effects from the great slowdown starting 1 year ago were far more severe than what happened in the United States or in Western Europe. On a visit to southern China, in January, I was standing on a hillside, and the person I was with was explaining to me that within our vision, 5 million factory jobs had been lost just in the previous 2 or 3 months, and the people have gone back to their villages. China has its stores of investments in dollar assets, but of course they lost so much. It has, and it has, even its planners think that for all of its manufacturing successes now, they are worried about the long-term prospects of the Chinese economy. Can it move out of the trap of making only low-cost products with commodity wages in competition with the poor of the world? So these economic problems. There are environmental problems, which are perhaps the most profound problems for China of all. Almost every kind of cancer is now in a significant uprise around China. There are episodes of birth defects. I've written a fair amount about these environmental challenges in the Atlantic Monthly during the time I was there. I'll simply say anybody who cares about China's future and the welfare of its people and that of the world recognizes how serious are these environmental problems. There are regional tensions to complement the regional diversity I mentioned before. There are political upheavals. There are all sorts of questions about whether the university system in China is capable of taking it to the next level. The simplest way I'll put this point is to say that when Barack Obama took office, he joked that for all of his good fortune and good luck in becoming America's president and America's first black president, he had 2 wars to deal with and financial meltdown and half a dozen other things all going wrong at once. But any sane person would prefer the problems an American president has to those the Chinese leadership has, because they have more problems to deal with a bigger country, with more fundamental issues, and a much poorer position to work from. So I think this is second on the list of underappreciated factors, that it has tremendous problems of its own. A third factor that I take more seriously, having lived in China than I did before I went there, is how spotty and uneven and even haphazard is the effectiveness of the control that we always hear about from the very powerful Chinese state. I think it's safe to say from American mass media and some American news reports that the popular vision of China's governmental control is something like the old Soviet Union or the old East Germany, or China as I remember it, and some of you do too, from the 1980s, when it really was a controlled state, when people really did watch what their neighbors did and what visitors did, where my hotel rooms in the 1980s were bugged whenever I traveled. And that is an image I think many, many people still have in mind without having been there. I submit that it is true that in certain areas, today's China is still controlled almost to that degree. The media are still very controlled. And I admire many Chinese journalists who are trying to press the limits of what they can do within controlled media. There are severe limits on assembly, simply because organization can be dangerous if not controlled. And so when I was living in Beijing before the Olympics, for about the 6 weeks before the Olympics, no gathering this large would have been permitted, just because it was dangerous to have too many people in one place. The political competition is obviously limited, and there are other issues where things are very, very tightly regimented, and you read about them in the papers all the time. What you don't as often read about in the papers, I contend, is how almost everything else is wide open, free-for-all, where the farther you get away from the government in Beijing and the farther you're away from these couple of issues, the way it seems like almost a state of nature with the good and bads that go along with that. The bads of the state of nature I would exemplify by traffic in many big Chinese cities. The one thing that truly frightened me, my wife was in fact run over while we were there. It's not just she's fine now. She was run over and she was crossing an 8-lane one-way street with the light by somebody going the wrong way against the 8 lanes through the light. So it's the traffic expresses much of the spontaneity and creativity that I think of as part of Chinese life. But I think that it is hard for people who have not tried to make their way through much of China to recognize how open much of it is, how most people in most of their lives do not interact with the state in any kind of controlling way. Again, the exceptions are very, very important, but they are particular identifiable areas, I would say. And this is This is, I think, an important part of just a realistic appreciation of the kind of place we're dealing with, what the government can and cannot do, what the people do and do not like about their situation. The subject of what the people do and do not like brings me to the next item on my list of underappreciated realities, which is how different the demands for liberty and democracy seem from inside China from the way they might from outside the country. And here's what I mean. I think from many people I've seen in every region or province of China except Tibet, which I was not able to get to, I've heard people from every walk of life talk about their interest in more liberty and liberties, freedom to choose where they can live, freedom to move about as they want, freedom to say things that they want, freedom to read things they want or buy things they want. I think the demand for liberty and liberties is a powerful one in modern China. It is increasing with economic welfare too. I would distinguish that from a demand for democracy, that is, for having actual elections to choose leaders above the village level. There are village level elections. There's some other kind of local forms of democracy. But it's striking to me how rarely that was mentioned to me by Chinese students, Chinese intellectuals, as something that is really important as the next step, as opposed to the expansion of personal liberties. This is important, I think, for the outside world in refining what it is the outside world is hoping for in China, hoping of China, and the kinds of things that we can support. I think there's been great value in the outside world interacting with Chinese groups to expand liberties, rule of law, all these aspects of civil society, as opposed to necessarily expansion of democracy. And I'll say more of that later on. Next on the list of the underappreciated phenomena, I would put the role of generations, that generations matter more than I think Americans typically are aware of. We recognize this phenomenon in our own country. There is the greatest generation, the people of my late parents' vintage who lived through the Depression and World War II and selflessly built the country and all of that. There is the baby boomer generation who everybody hates, people like me. And then there is the rising idealistic generation represented by the students in the room. And we know about the strengths and weaknesses of these generations. I was struck by even clearer distinctions in Chinese generations because the recent history has gone through so many dramatic changes during the span of one human lifetime. People who are in their 80s in China now have seen unimaginable hardship from the Western point of view. Some of the women still have bound feet. Not very many, but I have seen some of them. They've been through the civil wars. They've been through all kinds of occupation by the Japanese, of terrible hardship, and it is a miracle that they can see the kind of becoming prosperous China that is around them now. The people a generation below them, those in their 50s and perhaps early 60s, the senior level of the government and of some companies, although they're often younger than that, these people also have been tested in a way that many of their American counterparts have not been in terms of endurance. In my latest book, I talk about a man named Gao Xiqing, who's the head of the China Investment Corporation, the man who controls the largest pool of Chinese investment in the United States. He's in his mid-50s now. When he was 14, he worked building a railroad in Manchuria as part of the Cultural Revolution. His father was a Red Army general. He was, of course, kept out of college because the colleges were closed in the Cultural Revolution. He was part of the famous class of 1977, where they opened up the colleges again and 10 years' worth of people applied all at once. So the people who survived that were really impressive. He went to Duke Law School. He worked in a Wall Street law firm and then came back to China. He has been tried in a way not a lot of his American counterparts have been tried in quite the same physical way. I'd say that people in their 30s their youth has corresponded with this dawning of China's prosperity, and they are both happy about the things they have earned and worried about buying a house, being able to have some money to take care of their parents and all the rest. Younger people who are part of the single child generation have a whole different phenomena, which I will save for question time to go into. The main thing I'm getting across here is I think Americans rarely talk about these layers of Chinese society corresponding to the radical turns in Chinese recent history and how much they can affect the experience and the outlook of the people we are dealing with. This leads me to the next on the list of this items of underappreciated factors, which is how powerful, in my view, the residue of the Cultural Revolution still is. For the younger people in this audience who have not studied the Cultural Revolution, I'll say that when I was roughly your age, when I was actually a freshman at college, having a first lecture by a professor introducing us to world affairs. This was a professor named John King Fairbank, who was a very, very esteemed scholar of China. This was in the fall of 1966, when I was a freshman at college, and he said, something is happening in China and we don't know how to understand it. And of course, it was the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, when thousands of years worth of heritage were destroyed in many places, when the scholars of the past era were humiliated and stripped of their rank and punished. I won't go through the examples I've seen in people's lives of the toll this has meant. Some people, I will say, have said that they are proud of the way they grew as individuals during that time, that they were tested through hardship in a way that some others might talk about the hardship of combat and what combat, all the horrors of combat did to them. Many others don't talk about it at all because they're not really sure how the people they're dealing with spent that time. Almost as if you were in Germany in the 1950s and asking people what they were doing 15 years earlier. But my point is that cultures often have that cultural traumas are often most damaging in the long term when they're not fully discussed. And it's been difficult for China, the Chinese, because the same government is still by lineage and power in China as was during the Cultural Revolution. It's been hard to have the full airing of this national trauma. And I'll say as a side note, in rural China, it's often the case, I found, that farmers would dismiss the Cultural Revolution as a real part of China's trouble, saying, yeah, that was the time we had some teenagers come out and try to be farmers, and they weren't very good. What they emphasized and said, in much of the countryside, was the real trauma was 10 years earlier, during the Great Leap Forward, when half of the village's population might have died from starvation. My point here is this is part of conscious and subconscious memory in China, which many Westerners don't appreciate in quite the way they should. Even some younger Chinese are not fully versed in it too. But it struck me that its time bomb type effect is still there. Also affects China's sense of its own purpose. This leads me to the next item of the underappreciated factors, which is how uncertain and how much up for debate is still the Chinese sense of what its mission is, its role on Earth, what the meaning of being Chinese is. This is, I think, a very, very hotly contested idea in many ways, with debates about the role of Confucianism, whether it has a role in China, whether there is any residual communist model which is applicable anywhere, whether there's a development model to be applied in the rest of the world. It strikes me, however, that for a society as strong and as powerful and as important in the Earth's history as China has been through the millennia, it's striking how much this is still an uncertain and to be worked out issue for China, what it's for, what its message is to the world. An interim answer has been what we are for is taking people out of poverty. But at a certain point, that mission will be more accomplished than it has been, and some other mission will come up. Next on the list of underappreciated factors, how permeable I found Chinese society to be. I know that here is the word. I have an obscure English language word that I use to describe this phenomenon, which some of you will know and some instantly and some not. This is the word friable, as in friable soil. Friable soil is a kind of soil you can sort of stick your hands into and your fingers will be able to penetrate. It's not like hard clay soil. The soil of Chinese culture struck me as being friable. Many ways in which outside individuals, outside organizations could make connection at different points in China. I would distinguish it from Japan, where I lived for a comparable period of time and had much better success with language, but it's a much more, in my view, non-friable society, much more consciousness of us versus them. Of course, there's that consciousness in China, but also millions of points of access and connection. I could go through a long list. I think the adopted Chinese babies in the United States and the Western world build in connections between China and the outside world. often to a degree not appreciated within China. The academic exchanges are of enormous importance. So much of Chinese business and bureaucracy is staffed by people with graduate degrees from U.S. or UK or Australian institutions. That has a huge impact. Organizations, whether it's civic groups or legal exchange groups or whatever, tremendous connection between organizations, even the legacy of missionaries in the past and the colleges that they have built, and of course the business connections. Let me stress that I'm not saying here this is a matter of converting China through some kind of way of having a foreign presence which will make China something different from what it is. I am saying the nature of what China is makes it seem surprisingly to me connectable. There are synapses that can be matched in Chinese culture to people and organizations from the rest of the world, and that is a healthy thing, I think, for all involved. I have two other brief items to list, and I'm going to go to some of the meetings of this. The next to last item of what I think is underappreciated is the social and political role of technology in China. I will assert that 10 years ago, many Americans said, bring the internet to China and political control will end. I think the result is bring the internet to China and political control is more effective. I will defend that if you want. That's my assertion for now. I have a chapter about it in my book. But essentially, the internet has been a tool more of unifying control than it has been of dispersing the country. And that is a surprising effect of technology. Finally, on the list of surprises, I think, is the way China is positioned and predisposed to think about the United States in particular. I will use the comparison here with Japan. 20 years ago, when I first went to China, I noticed some degree of anti-Japanese feelings, of course, because of the wartime history. When I came back 3 years ago, I noticed much, much more of this anti-Japanese feeling. If you turn on, my experience was that if you turn on the TV each night, there's some drama on what happened in the 1930s and the various offenses of the Japanese. There are more museums of Japanese atrocities around the country than there were 20 years ago. So the Chinese predisposition to think about Japan is not such a friendly one, I will assert. I think there is a predisposition in dealings with England to have divided views. There's much connection and admiration. There also is the 100 years of humiliation the British were associated with. I am surprised that when it comes to the United States, there is as much predisposition to good relations as there is, by which I don't mean there's no tension. I don't mean there's no resentment. I don't mean there's no cultural friction. I do mean there's not a lot of emphasis on these two countries fighting each other during the Korean War. There's not a lot of emphasis on their fighting each other by proxy during Vietnam or all the other problems they have had, but more of cooperation, connection, and the rest. I think this can be easily thrown off by the sense of victimization I mentioned before, and we've seen examples of that. But I think the United States, to my surprise, starts out with less built-in conflict with China than might easily have been the case. That's my list of things that surprised me. Let me now move quickly through the things that I think this means for capitalism, for the United States, and for the young people in the crowd. And I'm going to do this in just kind of headline fashion so we can get to your questions soon. First, what does this mean for the future of capitalism and the way the world capitalistic business model is going to function? I'm going to divide this first, what it means for the U.S. version of capitalism, where the two main questions I think many Americans have are all the jobs on Earth going to go to China? And is all the money on Earth going to go to China? And essentially, will everybody else end up as a vassal slave of the Chinese investors? My short answer, I can give you a longer one, is no on both counts. That so far, the shift of manufacturing jobs to China has been beneficial for China has been more beneficial for China than it has been harmful for other people, including in the United States. And I can defend that later. And whether that pattern continues, I assert, is largely up to the United States, whether it's able to keep moving up the value chain of new products, new innovations. I'll defend that later if you want. That's my assertion. On the financial connection between the two countries, I'll say that at least for now, it's had a surprisingly buffering effect. You can imagine scenarios where you would have a kind of nuclear showdown coming over the debt that China holds in the United States, and they'd start selling dollars, and there'd be a spiral of panic. I'd say that so far that's not been the case, and there is a shared interest the two countries have. Here's the simplest way I can put this, and something I wasn't sure I believed before living in China. I'm convinced that for the United States, our interests are better off having a successful rather than a failed China. And I believe that from the position of Chinese leadership, they feel they're better off having a successful rather than a failed United States. We can go into that later, but that is an important distinction, that it's not that I view it as being not zero-sum. So in the capitalist model for the United States, I think there are obvious dangers and imbalances which the U.S. needs to work to correct, but they're not as dire as many people would suggest. A second capitalist implication. Is China going to have an economic model to replace whatever kind of model the U.S. has advocated over the last, ever long it's been? 20 years ago, during Japan's time of ascent, and during the time when Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew was very confidently talking about the new East Asian dominance, I think you heard more of that sort of talk than you do from China now, at least most of the time. Part of this, I think, is that China can't really be a model for anybody else because there's no other country like China. The only other place as big is India, and India is entirely different. And for everybody else, the combination of the areas where it's very controlled and the areas where it's very free, you can't really imagine that being pulled off. The sort of state capitalism that China has, it's hard to imagine that being replicated anyplace else. So as a practical model, it's hard for people to learn from. And as a theoretical model, I think it's going to be a while before we hear this advance as something that really people should model themselves on. A final sort of aspect of capitalism to consider is what the emergence of China means for the sustainability of a world trading system. And I think there are two aspects here worth considering. I think sustainability on an economic front will involve China taking on some of the responsibilities of becoming a great power as it is. There are burdens that fall to an economy and a state when it's a big power that it didn't feel when it was a small and developing power. China will need to adjust to these things, and the better it's able to do that, for example, in buffering the current financial crisis, the more successful the world will be. The other kind of sustainability, of course, is environmental. And there, I will just lay that on the table because I'm going to close on that point. So on implications for world capitalism, I think the United States is able to continue with the right kind of relationship with China, and it's a matter really of defending, of preserving what is best, strongest and best in the U.S. approach. One other brief political segment talking about what America should think about China, and then a word to the youth. So just to keep you following along at home, I was talking first about underappreciated aspects, then about the model of capitalism. Now I'm talking about specific issues for the United States. From my point of view, there are really three items on America's agenda in dealing with China, or three issues to consider. One is the military aspects of China's emergence. In general, I think these are a minor issue for the United States to worry about for quite a long time. That is a period of some decades. I think I was discussing with some students this afternoon, there is a real risk of miscalculation over Taiwan. Taiwan is the one issue where the U.S. and the PRC could really come to misunderstanding and even blows. But otherwise, I think the United States should not view China as a significant military rival in the short-term future. A second specific issue for the United States is how it feels about China's emergence. Does it feel defeated? Does it feel declining? A very strong message I give to the Americans in this crowd is don't feel that way. You shouldn't feel that way on specific grounds. The United States still has some powerful advantages that no other country, including China, I believe, can match anytime soon. Apart from its internal scale and its huge richness, it has two things that other countries can't match. Its ability to attract talent from around the world through immigration, as witnessed by many of you in this room. Either you'll stay in America, which will be good, or you'll go back home after being trained in America. That's good too. It's good for America either way. The other thing which the United States has, and is related, is its universities, which are a tremendous and I think unchallenged source of innovation and strength around the world. So America should feel strong and proud, but it should act confident and not thin-skinned, and it should act as if China's emergence and that of other countries is better for the world and better for us. That the worst aspects of China and of ourselves will be brought out if we act as if somehow this is taking things away from us for China to do well. That leaves the other issue for America, which is the environmental issue. From my point of view, items number 1 through 10 on the U.S. action item with China should be cooperation on the environment, because unless the U.S. and China work together on climate issues, everybody else is doomed too, including us. I will leave that point there. Finally, a word to the students. I see a number of you here. In a world that is going to be affected by a rising China, which we're all going to have to pay attention to because so many people are there, so much activity is there, so much dynamism is there, and so much excitement is there, how should you prepare yourself for the world of your adulthood, in which China will be a significant part? Does this mean you should feel defeated and hang-dog, as some Britons might have felt during America's rise to eclipse Britain? I think not. I think you should follow these steps. You should prepare yourself to succeed in this kind of world, which means language training, and it means scientific training, and it means learning to speak, and it means learning to write, and it means having the kinds of skills which matter more in this kind of world. You should prepare yourself to be comfortable with a world outside your own borders. I know many of you are living around the world. Many of you are living in China. I think the most valuable thing that Americans from ages 15 through 30 could do is spend a couple of years outside the country. Just get to know how the U.S. looks from outside and what other countries look like inside. So prepare yourself for success. Prepare yourselves to be comfortable with a world that includes a whole variety of cultures, and to have the confidence and the optimism that is the birthright of college-age students, that you can make things better during your time. And those of us who have the confidence and the optimism sometimes drained out of us or buffed out of us will look and take inspiration from you. So I feel better having met you all today, and I hope I've tried to make you feel better about the world that you as students are going to be able to operate in the future. So thanks very much, and now I'll be happy to take your questions. And so I'll be happy just to call on people as you raise hands. Yes?
First of all, thank you for coming. You mentioned Taiwan very briefly, and I wonder if you could go further into this subject.
The question is about Taiwan, and the questioner very shrewdly noticed I only said one sentence about Taiwan. So now I will, there were so many things I wanted to talk about. I was doing one sentence apiece, and then to go back in questions. Here is what I think about relations in Taiwan, where I've been many times in addition to the mainland. I think that in reality, the PRC government and the U.S. government and most of the world and most of the population on the island of Taiwan have the same interest. And the interest is essentially to let things keep going pretty much the way they are. There is increasing de facto integration of Taiwan with the mainland economy, with mainland culture, with all the rest. There was a significant step this year with direct flights back and forth between Thailand and the mainland. I used to, whenever I was traveling there, like you would go through Hong Kong or Macau, which was a huge nuisance. And in southern China, huge numbers of the factories are run by people from Taiwan, managers from Taiwan, student interchange back and forth. What could keep this from happening? I think what could keep it from, what allows it to happen now, for any of you who don't know this, is that since the Nixon administration, the United States has agreed with the mainland, with the PRC government, that there is one China. And the one China includes both the mainland and Taiwan and Hong Kong and the rest. And the United States admits there is one China, and it says force should never be used for tensions within this one China. And the U.S. doesn't have formal relations with the island of Taiwan anymore. What could make trouble is if groups on Taiwan, in my view, requested a formal statement of independence from the PRC. I believe that no government of the PRC could tolerate this. This is one of the few things that a PRC government simply could not stand and retain its legitimacy, since the threat of splitism is so great in China. And so if there were a declaration of independence or an independence movement, which the mainland government would have to suppress, they would have to do that, and the United States government would have to oppose that. So you would have a possible confrontation between China as a whole and the United States for reasons nobody wants and nobody intends. So I think a shared interest of the PRC government, the United States government, and I believe most people on Taiwan is the status quo. And I think the current government in Taiwan that's been more or less its policy. So I think there's tremendous flourishing of relations. That may or may not be your understanding of the situation, but that's my sort of U.S. national interest, that it's in U.S. national interest and world interest to avoid an unwanted World War I type showdown over Taiwan, which to my mind is the only way that the U.S. and the PRC could come to any kind of actual military confrontation. That's my view. Yes, sir. There.
In your list of issues Americans should be thinking about, one thing you didn't mention was resource competition, and particularly oil and the movement of China aggressively into Africa and other places.
The question is about resource competition, including China's buying up of oil resources in Africa and South America and minerals and all the rest. Yes, this is a phenomenon. I didn't include it in the underappreciated factors because I think there's been a fair amount of attention to it, and I don't really know what to make of it other than these two things. Number one, this is, as I was mentioning earlier today, it's essentially gunboat diplomacy without the gunboats. The Chinese companies are behaving the way many European and American companies did a century ago, trying to lock up resources in relatively vulnerable countries. The Chinese interests are doing it in a commercial way as opposed to all the overlay that formal colonialism had from the British and the French and the U.S. in various ways. So it is, in a sense, compared to the U.S. record, is less, or the European record is less intrusive. Second, I do think that there are I have some faith in market forces here, that there is, finally, commodities will be sold on the world market. And if Chinese firms lock up more of the oil, quote unquote, in Venezuela or in Africa or wherever, unless we're talking about actual embargoes, they will be selling oil to willing buyers, I think. To me, here's the way I think of this, that China's continued and essentially unlikely to be stopped economic development is going to place strain on a lot of resources. And these minerals are the most visible resources now, but the environmental ones are in a way that the most important and most potentially damaging resources, the ocean resources, the atmosphere, the carbon, and all the rest. So I view this as something which Chinese firms are doing in an understandable way, and I guess I am less concerned about this than other things. It seems to me that whoever owns these resources, they're still going to be sold. That may sound be an ineffective answer, but that's my best one. Yes. Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the environmental impacts of Chinese economic growth and what your perception of Chinese views on regulations or other types of preventative measures for environmental impacts.
The question is about the environmental situation in China, the regulations, their likelihood to connect, to cooperate internationally, and the effect of China's expansion. I guess I would do this in a series of these layers. The first point is that the environmental situation in China is, in many parts of the country, extremely bad, I would argue. When I was living in Beijing, there's a Twitter feed called Beijing Air, and it's from a sensor on the roof of the U.S. Embassy, which was secret for a long time until somebody, I knew of it, other people did, but until it was outed by somebody from I think, Time magazine. And the reason this sensor exists is that the official Chinese measurements do not include the most damaging kind of air pollution, the small particulates called PM 2.5. They measure only the larger particulates. And the measures of this PM 2.5, which you'll find on Beijing Air, are of a scale that no place in the United States has seen in 50 years. For example, I was doing a comparison map on the Atlantic site about 3 or 4 months ago when the highest reading in any place in the United States was something like 70 or 80, and that was in Yellowstone Park. Who knows? But for most cities, it was like 30 on the scale. And in Beijing that night, it was 580, which was in the sort of extremely hazardous realm. So, and one could go on. So there are real problems which the government in China is well aware of. The next point, I would say, is there is much more action and contention within China on this issue than most outsiders appreciate. I did a story in the Atlantic about this, trying to say, here's the problem, and here are all the forces being arrayed inside China to deal with it. For example, lawsuits are now being more allowed of sort of local pollution problems. And the evaluation system for judging Communist Party officials as they work their way up the career hierarchy now includes their environmental record too, not just their GDP growth rate when they're in a city or in a province. There are the World Wildlife Fund and the Environmental Defense Fund are conducting classes in the Central Party School for the Communist Party on how to do environmental protection. There's kind of interactions I was talking about. So there's action inside China. This is important so that outsiders, number one, don't just condemn what's going on, and number two, recognize there are ways to deal with the battle. Then the third thing I would say is that with the best will in the world and the best technology in the world, China simply is going to produce more carbon and more pollutants just because you still have a huge number of very poor people coming into the modern age. Here's one anecdote. I got to know very well a Chinese guy who works for a company that makes radically more efficient building glass, so window glass for buildings. Chinese buildings take about twice as much energy to heat and cool as American buildings because the insulation is so poor. So this is a way to cut down on that. And so his life's work is this environmentalism, but he told me one time that in his home village in Gansu province or someplace, his father maybe once a month would have a cold beer out of a refrigerator as a special treat. He says, in my apartment, I want a refrigerator. I want air conditioning. And so you're going to have hundreds of millions of people who go from once a month refrigeration to having a refrigerator. So there has to be some effort between China and the rest of the world to deal with climate issues and really radical technology steps on energy and carbon, because otherwise there just is going to be more pressure there. So it's a worthwhile cause for any of you who are both interested in technology and interested in China and interested in the world to be involved in. Yes, sir. Yes, in a plaid shirt, and then yes.
I guess touching on media and touching on like the liberties that you mentioned, how do you view the recent turmoil at Taiping and in terms of independent media or independent, like privately owned media?
The question is about the magazine Caijing, which is a kind of it's generally considered the most impressive business/investigative publication in China. A woman named Hu Shuli started it, 8 or 9 years ago, and she has found ways to push the frontiers of what is acceptable of doing exposés. One of my sons worked there. He worked there during the SARS epidemic in 2003 when he was right out of college. And he was their English language guy to interview the WHO people and the CDC people. He had a great time working for the magazine then. In the last month, there's been tremendous turmoil there. I should say the magazine's been a big success. Its issues are very thick. It has these widely attended conferences around China. It's been a real success story. And in the last month, suddenly there is turmoil where a lot of the staff has quit or threatened to quit. What I don't know, and perhaps some of you here can tell me, but what I want to find out is, does this mean, is this business driven? Is it driven by some kind of political controls on what they're reporting? Does it have to do with an effort to put together new Chinese media combines? I don't know, but that's something I want to find out about, and I'm trying to find out. If any of you knows, I'd be happy to hear. Yes, in the sweatshirt.
You said that Taiwan is one of the issues that could potentially become very divisive for U.S.-Chinese relations, but I'm wondering what the potential effects or repercussions of, disagreements over Tibet would be in the future.
The question is about Tibet and whether that could be as difficult for Chinese-U.S. relations in the future as I was saying Taiwan was. the context here is, I think that inside China, it becomes obvious there are a couple of priorities for the government which are not always understood or appreciated in the outside world. One is just kind of social control, which it's possible to have more sympathy for the desire for some control if you think what the last 30 years of relative stability have meant for China versus the previous 100 years of disaster. And that there is a way in which if people feel as if they are on the whole getting better, they will put up with other kinds of control. So social stability is one of them, I'd say. The other is what is often referred to in China as splitism, the idea that the territorial integrity of China would be violated, which mainly involves Xinjiang up in the northwest with the Uyghurs, Tibet in the southwest with the Tibetans, and of course Taiwan. Of these, Tibet is the one which is, I think, it's not likely to have a sort of a real showdown, as is the case, as the potential with Taiwan, but it's, I think, going to be a chronic sore between China and Europe and the U.S. for this reason, that the basic understanding of the situation in China is fundamentally different from the basic understanding in the Western world. And I'm now going to describe what I assert is the basic understanding of the man on the street in China about Tibet, and then contrast it. About 6 months ago, there was a big display in a place called the Cultural Palace of the Minorities in Beijing, where they had a big display on Tibet and the people of Tibet. This was the only place in the last 3 years I can think of where I had to show my passport to get in, because it was seen as a sort of potentially difficult and might be disrupted display. But it was a history of Tibet in two parts. One was called in English, Miserable Suffering Under Feudalism, and the other part was called Happy Prospects After Liberation. And so the miserable suffering under feudalism was picture after picture of Tibetan peasants whose eyes had been gouged out, according to the captions, by the lamas who were treating them as slaves. There was a picture of an entire human skin that had been flayed, so the caption said, from a peasant by a lama. There were stocks that people were locked into, et cetera, et cetera. That was the pre-liberation view of Tibet. The post-liberation, the opening scene was a Tibetan woman opening up a refrigerator full of beer. And you know, the beer and refrigerator theme are frequent. And there's a photo of a cement factory outside Lhasa and all the rest. And I think the widely, I'm being dead serious, the widely shared view among PRC citizens of every education level is that, number one, Tibet has always been an integral part of China, and number two, Tibet has been a backward part of China that the generosity of the PRC in the last 50 years has brought forward. So I'm describing a view. And the view in the Western world is not that. The view of the Dalai Lama from the PRC government, I think many citizens, is that this is a man who has fooled the Western world into thinking he is a spiritual leader when he actually is an agent of splitism and a political activist of great cunning. And therefore, there is both the standard protest from the Chinese government when the Dalai Lama interacts with Western leaders, and very, very little sympathy from the Chinese public for this Western view. So I think this is, of all the issues I encountered there, the one where there was least variation in individual view among the Chinese people I met. You know, usually I think it's 1 billion individuals with 1 billion views, but this is one where there was great consistency of view, much as a professor pointed out to me, much as Americans thought that Hawaii was really an integral part of the U.S. when Pearl Harbor was bombed. So, you know, that there are various myths the U.S. has about itself. So that's one point. There is a profound and total difference, near total difference in perspective on this issue in the two countries. Why this will not lead to conflict, in my view, is that while I think Western countries should stand up for what they believe in religious freedom and freedom of expression, and while it would be in the interest of the PRC government to have a better accommodation with Buddhist interests in Tibet, I think no practical person thinks that Tibet is going to become independent. And so that is why it is not therefore a powder keg or a tinder, whatever metaphor you want. So I know that many people may disagree with many individual sentences, what I've said, but that's my most honest description of the situation, that almost nobody within the PRC sees this issue the way most people in Europe and the US see it. And that is just a fact that is difficult to work with. You feel better? Yes, sir. And there, or actually, in the far yes, in the far back. Yes, sir.
You mentioned an awareness of the cultural revolution as a factor in life and how people think about Tiananmen. Is Tiananmen Square, is there any equal awareness of Tiananmen Square?
Question about Tiananmen Square, and actually, did I interrupt you? And the awareness of that. This will sound like an urban myth, but it is true that I have talked with university students in different parts of China, and they don't know what one is referring to in Tiananmen Square apart from the physical place. And it's easy to understand because, and here's a little side discourse on the effectiveness of and the skill of media control inside China. Media control inside China is not total. That it's done in a very shrewd way. The internet, if you want, you can get to any site in the world you want. If you want to get foreign publications, you can. If you want to hear anything or read anything, you can. But it's a nuisance. And so for most people, they are content with the huge abundance of stuff available within the bounds of the firewalled information. And if you live in that world and you go to and you live in the world of the schools, it's not something you're taught about. So my wife and I went there on the June 3rd this year, and I came as close as I came to being arrested while there. It was my fault. I idiotically took a picture of them arresting somebody else, which was who would have thunk? And it was. I think the government is aware that to the outside world, this is a very freighted phrase and very freighted anniversary, but it's on the morning of June 4th when we went there again, most of the population in the square were security officials in one layer or another of disguise and foreigners. And there wasn't any kind of huge Chinese presence there. So I think that it's unlike the Cultural Revolution, it's something that's just kind of, it's not that it's passing undigested, it's just passing. From the point of view, there are more and more people who are not aware of it so that's my view. So actually, there's somebody, yes, there in the gray shirt, yes.
Are there any particular successes or failures in urban planning that the U.S. could learn from?
That's an interesting question. I'm thinking there are things that the government is able to do in terms of infrastructure which are easier to do in China than elsewhere because of it's easier to bulldoze houses there than it is. So you can build. During the time we were in Shanghai, something like 4 entirely new subway lines opened at the time we were there, sort of in preparation for Expo, which is going on. So in terms of getting things done, it is admirable and impressive, but hard to replicate. Some of the new green cities I haven't really seen enough of to judge. I think that urban planning in general, I would not submit as a great area of success for China. The cities seem to... Shanghai is, to most Western eyes, more attractive than most other cities because much of it was laid out long ago and has smaller streets and historic buildings. That's a question I'm going to take under advisement. It's an interesting question. I don't know there's no immediately positive lesson that springs to my mind, but I will think, and it may pop out in 10 minutes in background processing. Yes, sir.
In the spirit of the future of capitalism, about a year ago it seemed that the Chinese financial system by design was headed toward the American model. Obviously, in the last 12 months, that's been called into question. I wonder what you think about reform in the capital markets, the convertibility of the renminbi, and are they going to continue on the track of reform toward the American system, or are all bets off?
That is also, like all these, very interesting. And let me approach it again in a couple of levels. There is a sort of convergence to the, quote, American system or world standards that I think will continue, and in the view of many Chinese authorities must continue, and that's towards transparency and honesty in general. The stock exchanges there, I think, the casino proportion is much, much higher than it is in most European or North American exchanges, and I feel sorry for many average Chinese people who have been taken to the cleaners in the stock exchanges over the last 2 years, and the duplicate books that people have and all the rest. So the whole area of transparency, I think there is an awareness at the high level that as part of China's maturation and moving up to higher value, this stuff has to be cleaned up. So there's no sense that, oh, this is good in the long run. So, but it's a matter of, will that be 1 year, it'll be 20 years, I don't know. But I think there's consensus that has to continue. There's a second aspect where I think there is not now and never was much of a determination to converge on a Western model, and I think that involves convertibility of the RMB. To telescope the argument here, the secret both of China's success with a lot of manufacturing jobs and its accumulation of these huge assets is that the exchange rate is controlled. It's not so much that it's low as that it's controlled, and that banks, when they receive dollars, have to turn them over as contraband, to the central bank, which then manages them with flows back here. And I think there is still a sense that has been essential to the stable, non-volatile development of Chinese manufacturing and exporting. It's not so much that it's a high or low level as it doesn't change very fast. And I think there is, if anything, the last year has probably redoubled the sense that they're going to stick with that for a while. Then there is at least one other aspect, which is the largest sense of what China's economy is for. Because what China's economy has been for so far is producing these low-wage jobs, which has been done at huge numbers. And tens of millions of people have moved from the farms at $100 a year to the factories at $100 a month. And that's a good thing. But half of all the wealth produced by China is not consumed by Chinese people. It's in one form or another exported to the rest of the world. And I think there is some sense of, can that continue? Will the rest of the world be a sort of repository for this, and is it really good for China to have this kind of imbalance? So that's a sort of convergence on a mature, non-mercantilist capitalist system where I think there's a sense that would be a good way to move, but how to do it tomorrow or whatever. So it's your question brings up a lot of different aspects, and that's my stab at several of them. Yes, here. Yeah.
I'm not pronouncing this correctly.
I'm not going to either, so.
But we've been hearing about the unrest between the ethnic Han Chinese
and the Uyghurs. Yeah.
Right. And the media controls being what it is in China. Does the rest of China know about this, or this is just something that's told out to the West?
So the question is about the unrest in Xinjiang between the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese, and whether the Chinese population knows about this. And certainly this is a highly publicized event, as were the upheavals in Tibet this past spring. And the difference is the way in which it's publicized. And certainly the film you saw about Tibet during the uprisings there was of Tibetan mobs beating up and killing and burning out Han Chinese people. And similarly, the stories that I've seen on Chinese blogs or gotten from friends in China about Xinjiang are mainly about Uyghur terrorism against Han Chinese. For example, the stories about the syringes. There was an epidemic, it was said, of people using syringes to stab, Uyghurs using syringes to stab Han Chinese. So it is publicized there, but with a certain kind of spin. I think the government has tried to damp it down somewhat. There's been a little bit of more balanced coverage, but that is essentially the plot line of an ungrateful minority, which again the United States helped classify as a terrorist group after 9/11, which was a foolish thing to do, the East Turkestan Liberation Front. So that's a short answer. Yes, sir.
A couple questions on the one-child policy. One, how effective has it been in population reduction? How long does it continue? And what effect does it have on the coming rising generation?
There are a number of Chinese people here could probably answer that with more, in better ways than I can. My sense would be, number one, it's been hugely important to the country. And while many people individually talk about problems it's caused, inconveniences it's caused for them, almost nobody I met said, oh, this was a bad idea overall, just because there are such a weight of people in China. So it's been hugely important for the country and having some way to manage the numbers. Number two, will it continue? It continues, yes, but with various loopholes. In the countryside, you see bigger families. I believe it's the case that if two only children marry, they can have more than one child. And there are ways in which you can that you can buy your way out of this. So I think it will continue, but in non-draconian way. Its effects are manifest. Certainly it has an actuarial effect with lots of retirees and relatively few young people. It has a male-female effect since there are more men than women. It's said to have a psychological effect since people are not raised with siblings and don't learn about fighting amongst siblings as I did with my brother all the time. They didn't learn that wonderful lesson. So there are many effects, but I think it's a feature of the landscape and is probably a necessary feature of the landscape for the foreseeable future. Yes, there was a hand. Yes, sir.
How you alluded to this before. How viable do you feel that China's government is in a decidedly non-democratic state? Because I won't pretend to be nearly the expert that probably most people in this room are on China, but when I was there, I was sometimes struck by the impression that maybe democracy is more of a luxury than the necessity that we kind of.
So the question is, how viable is the government, and whether democracy is a luxury rather than a necessity in that part of the world? On the viability of the government, my impression is that the people at the top of the Chinese government are very, very aware of all the things that could make the government non-viable, from a revolt of the impoverished masses against a communist leadership to economic reversal to environmental disaster or whatever. And so I think they are alert to those problems and try to deal with them and stamp out and address problems as they arise. Stamp out's the wrong term because that suggests Soviet Union-style repression. I mean address the problems. For example, after 20 million people lost their jobs early this year, there were new health programs in the countryside, new construction programs, and all the rest. So I think its viability is always in question, but you have to be impressed that it's been viable as long as it has, and you have to sort of give the benefit of the doubt, at least in the short run. On the democracy front, that is a question, I think, for Chinese people to answer for themselves. My sense as a universalist is I clearly believe in liberty for people all around the world. And I'd be happy, I argue with my Chinese government friends that there should be more liberty for China. Premier Wen Jiabao was saying that as for democracy, yes, that's the future of China, but he said it might be a century or so. So it's who knows? So I concentrate myself on liberty for a big, difficult-to-govern country and will encourage the Chinese population themselves as they think about the role of democracy in that mix. So perhaps I don't want to keep anybody. I'm happy to stay here all night. I have no place else to go, but I don't want to keep you. So yes.
You've suggested that there's little cause for conflict between China and the United States. And there's kind of a conventional wisdom that before September 11th, the Bush administration, particularly the neoconservative bloc within it, was kind of butting heads with China. And was that just jingoism on the part of the jingoistic administration, or was there some kind of deeper cause?
The question is about conflict between China and the U.S. and whether there was a neocon movement against China before September 11th. On the conflict between China and the U.S., I think the most precise version of what I meant to say was there's no necessary or automatic cause for conflict. Conflict could well arise, but it's amazing how few inevitable sources of conflict there are compared, say, to Russia and China sharing their borders and all the rest. There can be conflict, but it also can be avoided, I think. Pre-September 11th, here is a story I will tell you, which addresses your point. I have met over the years Gary Hart, the former senator from Colorado, and he was the co-chair of the Hart-Rudman Commission. The Hart-Rudman Commission was the commission which, a couple of months before 9/11, delivered a report to the Bush administration saying, Islamic terrorists are really gunning for us, and this is something you have to be aware of, and Al-Qaeda is a particular source of problem. This was, not covered in newspapers, didn't get any attention, but that was the Hart-Redmond Commission. He said that during the deliberations of the Hart-Redmond Commission in 2000 and 2001, there was one female member of the commission who kept saying, all this Islamic stuff is a distraction. The problem is China. China's big, China's growing, it's building its navy, you've got to pay attention to China. And everybody else said, no. She said, no, you got to pay attention to China. Finally, this woman resigned from the commission because they were not giving the time of day to her warnings about China. And that woman was Lynn Cheney, a wife of Dick Cheney. And so I think it is a matter of record that before 9/11, a lot of the journals that soon afterwards were sort of ready for war with Iraq were ready for war with China. Now, I don't understand why neocon groups should have China as their enemy. Maybe just plain old anti-communism, I don't know. But it is part of the historical record that there's a tendency in the military, if you're going to build, there's certain kinds of weapons for which you need a big enemy to justify them. For an aircraft carrier, you need some big country to be against, and certain kinds of aircraft too. And it doesn't count, to go against Afghanistan. So I think that there's certain kind of military budgeting for which China is required as a potential foe. And I'm just telling you how I see it. So how about I'll take? Will you call? Feel free to leave, but I'll feel free to stay. Yes. For these two first, yes.
I'm struck by what appears to be a contradiction. On the one hand, you talk a good deal convincingly about the diversity.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when I taught in Shanghai 20 years ago, educators were keenly aware of the fact that so much of the instruction was rote, with very little diversity encouraged. That hasn't changed particularly because I talked to someone today who was invited to give a keynote address at an educational conference about the importance of creativity as opposed to what they were doing. So how do you account for that? On the one hand, you have the diversity. On the other hand, as we refer to media control, and you have an educational system which seems bent on drill and practice and an absence of diversity.
Excellent question again. How do I explain the contradiction between a billion individuals and a rote learning system, all the diversity of China and the hammered home rote of the education system? Let me use this analogy. We think of both Italians and Irishmen as highly individualistic peoples, and yet they all learn the catechism. As two Catholic countries, that I think there is. I think that both parts of the observation that you make are correct. My experience is of an individualistic place with each person his own little entrepreneur, but also an education system which is not that way at all. Therefore, I think the educational system is a big problem for China, and I think is largely seen that way. And I was talking to a lot of people this spring and doing a lot of writing about the nationwide examination system, and everybody recognizes it as being a sort of an ordeal that doesn't serve any real goal. But they say without that, there'd be no fair way to allot the places. There would be bribery and everything else. So it's terrible, but it's the fairest thing. And I think that is representative of a lot of what I heard about the educational system. It's bad, but what else can we do? And we can still go to graduate school around the world. So I think it's an individualistic country with a non-individualistic educational system. That's the best I can do. Yes.
What problems, if any, do you see in the acquisition of so much American debt?
The threats, the risk in the acquisition of American debt. I think that there are. What are the problems? I think one problem is a potentially unstable dynamic. That when the economies and the financial systems become so interconnected, then if there is a rupture, like over Taiwan or something else, the damage is the greater. So there is that potential instability. There is the potential, I think, not yet exercised, but potential of political influence. Since the money is largely either state-directed or state-influenced, that to the extent there are emerging political differences that are important, either at the sort of local level or national level, it could be a tool of international influence. And I think, finally, it's just not wholesome or sustainable for either society in the long run to be as unbalanced as both of them are now. For China to be sending half of all its wealth overseas, and for the United States to rely so much on other people's wealth for consumption. So I think that all those things it's unhealthy, but it's a matter of changing it in a gradual way as opposed to a traumatic way. Yes, sir.
Staying with that subject, what is your feeling from the Chinese point of view towards the U.S. as a sole reserve currency? And where is that going, and how long will it take?
The question is about the sole reserve currency. Is this in China's interest or not? Are they serious when they start talking about a threat? I think there are short-term and long-term issues here. There's sort of immediate issues, near-term issues, and then long-term issues. The immediate issue is a shared U.S. and Chinese interest in avoiding a panic on the dollar, because that's bad for both of them. It's bad for the Chinese in two ways. One is asset loss. The other is terms of trade. If the RMB goes up too fast, and they have those. So there's a shared U.S. and Chinese interest in not having a panic. In the near term, I think there is also, it would be inconvenient for China to have the RMB exposed more to world trade. Because as I was saying earlier, it's been a crucial part of the development model to be able to control it and to be able to say, okay, it's going to rise, but only so much and over years. And so as it's exposed, as every world currency knows, you lose that much control over your internal management. Now, in the long term, the question is, will there come a time in 5 years or 10 years when it's seen as to the economic and strategic advantage of the Chinese to have either not the dollar or a basket or the RMB more actively traded? It's hard for me to see why having the RMB really be exposed is going to be in their advantage anytime very soon, except for some of the kind of purchasing advantages that the U.S. has. But I can see moving towards the basket type idea or some invented currency, which actually I think would be better for the U.S. too. Be better for the U.S. not to have to run chronic trade deficits as we do to fund the rest of the world's financial system. So I think we have also here, strangely, a shared interest, and that it would be better for both of us if the dollar. Better for both of us in the short term, stable dollar, in the long term, not the dollar as a reserve currency. In the far back, yes.
Two things. First of all, I started reading a book called, I think the title is something like, "What the heck are you trying to say, Mr. President?"
Yes, I'll tell you about that.
The light bulb went off. I think you're the fellow who's mentioned in the beginning.
Who is misquoted, I'll tell you about it.
I was going to ask you how accurate that is. Nonetheless, the question I have is with regard to just democracy in general. When you talk about sort of the situation as we know it over there, you think would be rife with corruption, but I would think an average Chinese person, you were saying they're more intent on liberties, might say, well, democracy has its own form of corruption. And I remember 10 years ago speaking with a Chinese woman who runs a restaurant south of here, and she said to me, China's too big for democracy. She saw positives in our society, but she said, China's too big. And so, anyway.
That last line is, I'll restate the question. First, is China too big for democracy, as said by a restaurateur near here, and then about the book, "What the heck are you up to, Mr. President?" I can't count the number of times I've heard China too big for democracy. So yes, that is a familiar line of argument. I'm not willing to accept that totally, but you see what they're getting at. It's a big, sprawling place with lots of emergencies. And you also see what people are getting at and saying, oh, gee, your democracy really works so well in the U.S. Senate right now. It really works so well in your elections and your election financing. So I think the best advertisement the U.S. made for democracy was the past presidential election, in my view, of showing it that a democratic country could make a fundamental change in course that would be very hard to do for another kind of system. The worst kind of argument is what we see on the news each night about political arguments in Capitol Hill. So for various reasons, I recommend we concentrate on liberty as opposed to democracy. A word about Kevin Mattson's book, What the Heck Are You Up to, Mr. President? It's a book about Jimmy Carter's famous malaise speech in 1979. I had left his employ by then, and also he didn't use the word malaise. Those of you who were not born at that time, this was the summer of 1979. Carter was in trouble in the polls. He went to Camp David and gave a speech saying there was something wrong with the American spirit, and we had to deal with it. The book points out that this was actually very popular speech and actually stands up well in history until 3 days later when he fired his cabinet. And then there were many members of his cabinet, and then he wasn't so popular after that. It seemed to be chaotic. The part I was referring to is that there's an early scene where I am allegedly talking with Jody Powell about criticisms I've made of the president, and Jody Powell allegedly says X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, this guy, Kevin Mattson, never tried to contact me about that, and unfortunately, Jody Powell is dead, and it's who I was very sorry that he died 2 months ago. So I hate to contradict the tale of somebody who recently died, but I was sorry the author never contacted me. But it's an interesting book and worth reading.
Looks like midterm exams and papers are taking their toll, so thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.